Welcome everyone. Hello. Thank you for so many of you joining in. Welcome to our forum. My name is Megla. I work at the Eurasian Nexus Partners. The Vienna Global Leaders is a part of, I would say, our community arm. And we hold these forums, inviting experts from across the world, from the fields of business and in civil society. And the idea is to share best practices and discuss topical issues that affect all of us and we're concerned with. Today's topic is one of those topics, and we have two wonderful guests here who will be having a conversation. I would like to start with introducing our first speaker, and this is Lord John Alderdice. He's no stranger to our VGL forum, and we welcome him back again as a key speaker. He's the director of the Centre for Resolution of Intractable Conflict and emeritus chairman of the Centre for Democracy and Peacebuilding in Belfast. He's had an illustrious career. There's so many credentials to speak of, but I will just name a few. As the leader of the Alliance Party of Northern Ireland, he's played a significant role in the negotiation of the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. And he was then the Speaker of the new Northern Ireland Assembly. Since 1996, he has sat as a Liberal Democrat life member in the House of Lords and was the convener of the Liberal Democrats in the House during the Conservative Liberal coalition. During 2020 and 2021, he was the deputy chairman of the committee and a member of the special COVID select committee in the House of Lords. Welcome, John.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Bijan Khajehpour. Bijan is the managing partner at UNEPA, Eurasian Nexus Partners, and Atia Capital. He's a veteran strategy and risk advisor, political advisor. He's a commentator with a particularly extensive experience in the West Asian markets. He has over 25 years of strategic consulting experience in global companies. Bijan has also been involved in mediation and negotiations of international business and investment partnerships, and he's a fellow of the International Dialogue Initiative, IDI. With this, I'm going to hand over to Bijan, who is going to take today's conversation forward with Lord Alderdice. Thank you, Bijan.
Thank you, Megla. Thank you, everyone, for joining. It's a pleasure to moderate this discussion with my good friend, Lord John Alderdice. Both of us, John and I, are members of the International Dialogue Initiative. Just very briefly on that, International Dialogue Initiative is a group of international experts that try to analyze and discuss different global events through a psychologically informed dialogue. And that approach, psychologically informed dialogue, is going to guide our discussion today. And for those of you who don't know Lord John Alderdice, John and I had a similar discussion on the VGL forum in August 2020. And I just want to mention this because it gives us more incentive to listen carefully today. Back then, John predicted that the current confrontation between the West and Eastern powers may actually turn into a hot confrontation. And unfortunately, we have been witnessing that hot confrontation between Russia and with the Russian invasion in Ukraine, but obviously between Russia and Western powers. And it's reaching new dimensions, as we will discuss today. And for me, it's important to recognize that someone like John has the foresight and has the inside analysis to understand complex international affairs. And John, thank you again for your time and for your insights. Help us understand what's happening now with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and obviously all the consequences that we are witnessing on the global stage.
Well, thank you very much, Bijan. It's a pleasure to be doing this piece of work with yourself, as it always is. We get on well together, and I always find that something new comes out of our conversations. As far as the current crisis is concerned, I think that there are a number of levels on which we can look at it. Obviously, we can look at the fact that Russia has invaded Ukraine and is not doing it as successfully as it expected. And the West has been drawn in to give practical and political and economic support to Ukraine. And this is a war. This is a hot war, as you quite rightly said, and we don't know how widely this will spread. It may stay with Russia and Ukraine. It may spread into Moldova and other contested spaces, and it could go further beyond that. President Putin has been threatening that if the West continues to give substantial practical and material support, he will regard that as an act of war, and he will, by implication and maybe even more than implication, he has threatened the use of nuclear weapons of some order. Now, there are two or three aspects of this. The first, as I say, is the war with Ukraine itself. And there's no doubt that for a very long time, President Putin has had his eyes on Ukraine. Back quite a number of years ago, I spoke in the House of Lords about this and said that it was dangerous. We had to pay attention to it. We had to try to make sure we did not do things that would make it worse, because there was a real danger that it would end up in a violent war and conflict. And the reason that I said that was because although Ukraine was an independent nation and state recognized by Russia after the breakup of the Soviet Union, it was clear to me that there were those within Russia who never accepted what had happened with the breakup of the Soviet Union. And particularly people like President Putin, with his background in the KGB. There were many elements who were welcoming the breakdown of the Soviet Union, many elements in various European countries and within Russia itself who welcomed it, but there were those who resented it because they felt that it was a huge, humiliating defeat for historic Russia. It wasn't even the question of whether it was communist or not. It was a defeat for historic Russia. And Russia saw itself, and historically, of course, there was justification for this, saw itself as being a leading world power and had gone through a period of time when we had a bipolar world, which was led by the United States on the one hand and the USSR on the other hand. And when that breaks down and it becomes a unipolar world with the United States as the unchallenged leader of the world for a number of years, Russia resented this enormously and was looking for any possibility to retrieve its own esteem and, in practical terms, its control over the old Warsaw Pact area, or as much of that as was possible. And I'm firmly of the view that there were things that could have been done at the time that would have ameliorated that. If, for example, the West had made it very clear that this was the time when there could be a new world order, but it could only be done with collaboration with Russia and indeed, of course, China and India, Brazil and others. But for the sake of this discussion, particularly Russia, then I think there would have been the possibility of a different outcome. And maybe even someone like Putin might not have come to the fore, but certainly if he had, the early indications for him were not quite as negative as what we have seen more recently, and led some people to be overly optimistic about what would be likely to happen. That's not what happened. The West was a bit triumphant, and indeed the European Union and NATO began to expand their influence by request of the countries involved. There's no question about that. There was no attempt to conquer areas or anything of that kind. It wasn't meant to be aggressive or seen by Europe as being aggressive, but rather as opening up the possibilities. But it was perceived in Russia. And this was no secret. It was very clear. It was said time after time and repeatedly. President Putin wrote articles and made speeches which declared all of this. But people didn't want to take it seriously. They didn't want to believe it. And there was a bit of a divergence here because there were those in the intelligence world who were used to reading the rooms. And they said, well, you know, there's a real threat here. And then there were people on the political side who said, but that will be completely crazy. There's no way that could be successful. There's no, he's not mad, you know, he's not going to do this. He'll threaten, but he's not going to do it. And they didn't really take it seriously. They didn't believe that there was such a driver. And part of this is because we are terribly taken with a rationalistic understanding of how people behave and how states behave. It's a sort of Enlightenment notion that everything happens on the basis of rational decisions that are based on socioeconomic and power interests. And in truth, we are driven often by how we feel about things. And we may well do things that end up being self-destructive. We don't necessarily believe at the time that they will be. We are optimistic about, you know, how our interventions will result, but nevertheless, we are driven by these feelings. And unless you understand that, you make the wrong judgment call about how people are likely to behave. You don't understand that if they feel humiliated and disrespected and treated unfairly, then they're not going to be satisfied with something that doesn't appease that. So that's the first kind of dimension of things that's important to understand. The second, in really exemplified in the title of that's been given to this conversation, is that since the First World War, but also the Second World War, there's been a recognition that we are getting to be more and more dangerous as human beings. The First World War involved millions and millions of people being killed by more and more powerful weapons of war. And then, of course, was followed, we sometimes forget, was followed by a pandemic where more millions and millions of people died. But in terms of the war, there was a recognition that this was terrible. And so you have the attempt to create a League of Nations whose purpose was to make sure we did not go back to war. And it didn't work. And people said, well, it didn't work because there were still empires. And those empires still wanted to not be tied down by international rules and regulations. And therefore, we've got to construct something that will hold on to that. And after the Second World War, which in some senses was even worse, and of course, importantly, ended in 1945 with a nuclear explosion, well, 2 nuclear bombs being dropped. People said, whoa, this is really serious. I mean, we're not at a point where we can destroy ourselves. Every war that had ever taken place up until then took place with the knowledge that it would not end up in the destruction of the world, because our capacities for destruction were relatively limited. Terrible if you were in Dresden or in somewhere that got bombed, but it wasn't going to end the world. But after 1945, you could not have that confidence, because nuclear war could indeed end with complete catastrophe for human beings and for the planet. So at that point, there becomes a different sort of approach to it, one of what we would call international law. And terms like crimes against humanity and genocide and so on really come in from the Nuremberg trials, where the victors, United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, and very importantly, decide to set up a court where they will use a form of law like domestic law, but internationalized. And they will go through the whole process of indicting people and so on and so on. And out of that comes a perspective that says there can be such a thing as international law, just as we have domestic law, and we can set down things, requirements, the most striking of these being the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says that this is the way as individuals and countries we should behave. And if we don't behave in that kind of way, then the international community can begin to implement certain kinds of sanctions. But that's where the problem arises. Because first of all, it is assuming that there is at the top of the hierarchy of world authority, there is some kind of agreed seat of authority. And in the early days, and continuing right on through, this has been the Security Council of the United Nations. And with 5 permanent members who were from the victors in the Second World War. They weren't just chosen to be on the Security Council as permanent members because they were the largest countries or the most powerful countries or whatever. They were significant and powerful and so on, though these things change as time goes on. But they were there because they were on the victorious side. And the second challenge was, what is the sanction? How do you police any decisions that this international body takes? Is there an international police organization that can say, right, we have the power, the resources, the authority to hold people to account? Well, the truth was that for a period of time, it was looking pretty promising. There's no doubt that after Nuremberg, and there was a general improvement, there was a widening of democracy. More and more countries appeared to be living by the rule of law, both domestically and in international relations. It was looking pretty good. To some extent, I have to say, it was looking pretty good because of where you looked. You know, if you actually looked at what was going on, for example, in the Soviet Union, there's no way that fulfilled international law. It didn't respect the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And when China, from the Beijing the Chinese, began to take their seat instead of the Taiwanese at the United Nations, you had another member of the Security Council of the United Nations, which was not very respectful of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, either domestically or internationally. Although with China, that was much less of an issue than with Russia. And as time has gone on the one hand, you've had more and more rights proclaimed and responsibilities, for example, the responsibility to protect, but no way of implementing it in a clear, recognized, financed, and acceptable way. And I think that what is happening now is that you're beginning to see what could be the end of the United Nations system, because we are now splitting into those who, on the one hand, support the United States, the European Union, West, Australia, Canada, and so on, and those who run with and maybe even quite strongly support Russia and China. And this includes countries like India under the Hindu nationalist Prime Minister Modi, but it also includes quite a lot of sub-Saharan African countries who have been feeling that they got more help, whether it's recently with COVID or whether it's economically over a period of time, without having to answer lots of questions about human rights and law and so on and so on. More help from Russia and China without any questions asked than they've been getting from the United States, Europe, and so on and so on. And I noticed this, I spoke about this past week, for example, in a country like Zimbabwe, where Britain has a long kind of relationship, and not a very happy one, and there's a lot of difficulty about how human rights are actually implemented and civil rights are implemented in Zimbabwe. And what happened when the vote came at the United Nations General Assembly? Zimbabwe refused to vote with the West, with the United States, Europe, Britain, Australia, and so on, because actually they felt more assistance from Russia and indeed China in recent times. So we're finding this split taking place, I think, which, if we are not very careful and energized about it, could begin to see the end of the United Nations and a split into a polarized world. And that is a very dangerous place for us to be.
Thank you, John. Very comprehensive response. In fact, you answered a number of my questions. But let me ask you this, especially when you were talking about the sort of bipolar world gradually shifting into the unipolar world. Do you think that the notion of strategic thinking in the Western countries sort of was forgotten in a way, in them thinking that they are basically dominating the world and hence they don't really need to pay attention, and as such they missed not only the activities or maybe emotional and psychological realities in Russia, but also basically got a number of other international developments wrong and reacted wrongly? And if yes, what is it that the Western nations, Western governments have to do to understand the world better. I appreciate your suggestion that we need to base decisions more on dialogue, which is true. We in too many cases it's just a monologue. In fact, I've heard from a number of countries that either abstained or voted against the UN resolution against Russia, that they said what the West was wrong in was to choose to criticize Russia based on what they called rules-based international order. Well, within the rules-based international order, the US and a number of European countries also have broken international law without really being penalized. So what is it that Western governments have been missing, and what is it that they should be doing in the future?
Well, this is very, very key, Bijan. And I think that what happened with, not just with the breakup of the Soviet Union from a practical and political and to some degree at least military and strategic point of view, but also from the point of view of political and economic ideas, the West felt that it had simply won. And you saw this most notoriously in the statement by Francis Fukuyama that effectively liberal democracy was the end of history. What he meant was not that the world was going to end. On the contrary, he felt very optimistic about it at that time. But he felt that liberal democracy was the final stage of human social evolution, and that there was nothing better. That was the perfect way. Well, he now realizes that that was a piece of arrogant nonsense. But at the time, I think the important thing was not so much that he said it, but that it did represent a perspective that was very strong in the West. The European Union, the United States, Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and so on, felt that they really had fulfilled the ideas of the Enlightenment that had been established some hundreds of years before, and there was no serious challenge to that. You know, this was, how could you possibly beg questions about some of these fundamental things like human rights, equality, the capitalist system, and so on? Nobody had an alternative project that was persuasive. And because of that, frankly, arrogance and naivety about reality. I mean, in science, the key thing is, you know, you have never arrived at a final outcome of understanding. There are always more things to understand. You know, there were physicists at the end of the 19th century who basically thought, well, you know, there's a few little bits and pieces to fit in, but basically we've got the plan. And then, you know, the 20th century comes in and Heisenberg says you haven't, clue what you're talking about. It's not the case at all. You can't even measure some of these things, not just because you don't have good enough instruments, but in principle, there are some things that you can't measure. Well, this is an enormous shock, which is not yet fully being digested, not just in the material sciences, but perhaps even more particularly in the social sciences. I had a discussion with a colleague a couple of days ago who was trying to tell me that there were why were we not able to predict these things? We should be able to predict these things. And I said, you can't predict something. You know, you can hazard a guess. You can sometimes get it right or wrong. But you cannot predict certain things, because complexity theory helps us to understand that some things simply are not predictable. You don't know what the outcome is going to be. But there was this sort of arrogance. And when you become arrogant, you stop listening to people. This is going to be one of Putin's problems at the moment, is that he has become rather arrogant and he doesn't listen to people. And then things go terribly, terribly wrong. But when we talk about dialogue, which you mentioned, Bijan, dialogue is a two-way thing, you know. Otherwise it's a dialogue of the deaf, you know, where somebody talks and the other guy has to listen. And so this conversation, this dialogue, means we've got to listen. And an old friend of yours and mine, who's a member of the IDI, Ed Shapiro, recently said that the thing he'd learned over many years as a psychoanalyst is he had to ask the question, this guy that I don't agree with, what is he right about? Not was he wrong about, I can write loads about that, but what's he right about? Because if he holds something very strongly, he's got the hang of something that is meaningful to him emotionally as well as intellectually. And I need to understand that if I'm going not just to engage and have a relationship, but actually progress in my own thinking about things. Even within the West itself, many people began to be very unhappy that, for example, the wealth of the West was not being shared out, not so much entirely equally, which is completely impossible, but even fairly. And so you got people arising, like, you know, the sort of Steve Bannons and the ultra-right and so on. And they don't have an alternative plan. They just have a view that we need to wreck the system that's there in the hope that something else better will emerge from it. Well, of course it might, or it might be a total disaster, which is even more likely. But the point is that even within the West, there is not unanimity that we've arrived and we really know what we're talking about. And right across the world, there's absolutely no agreement that the views of the Enlightenment and the West and so on are the way to go. And we're at a point where what the West needs to be doing is listening more, not necessarily because it's going to agree. It's not. We're never going to reach agreement. Isaiah Berlin made that clear. He said, there is no agreement on the good. That's why we need pluralism, so that the different ways of working together can be held without violence and war. But it's that listening and trying to understand where the other guy or girl is coming from, rather than believing, I have the truth, you're wrong, and we've got to make sure that you're put right one way or another.
Thank you. Just as a reminder to our participants, I will ask 2 short questions, and then I would like to take questions from you. If you please put your questions into the chat, I will ask as many questions as possible by the end of the talk. John, leaving governments and international institutions aside, I would like to talk about 2 groups. One, civil society. Obviously, actually, a lot of the participants here are business leaders, they're members of the civil society. If we, and we know that our governments and some of the international institutions have failed, what is there that we can do as civil society? Obviously, promoting dialogue, something that you are doing, and others, but anything that comes to your mind that we can do if the international and national institutions cannot protect other world citizens, is there something we can do, apart obviously from solidarity with the people in Ukraine and other affected areas? The third group are just citizens. I was talking to actually a few of our colleagues 2 days ago, all from across Europe, and we realized that there were 3 different reactions within Europe to the Russian aggression against Ukraine. There were some who were panicking first, but then sort of it became the norm, and they started going about their lives as if nothing had happened. A second group that were aware, these are countries that are closer to Russia and maybe knew Putin and Russia better. They are in a constant state of fear. And a third group that initially said, oh, it won't happen, it won't last long, because as you said, they also believed that Putin would be rational in the end, but now are starting to panic. Especially from a psychological point of view, and especially talking to business leaders, what is it that, again, we can do to address these emotions, these fears, and also help people understand these very complex situations?
First of all, about civil society, one of the, I think, mistaken perspectives has tended to be that civil society is a sort of homogenous set of people who link together terribly agreeably and take a kind of progressive, slightly left of center perspective internationally and support human rights and all sorts of things like that. But that's not the case. If civil society is genuinely civil society, then it represents different perspectives. And if it is going to provide an example to governments who don't behave and agree very well with each other, and other organizations, then civil society itself has got to become more inclusive in its preparedness to engage with people. I'll give you an example. Much of what would be described as civil society would have a particular perspective in terms of the role of women in society, or the importance of secularism or whatever. But what that means is that you are not actually paying attention to other huge areas of civil society that don't have the same perspective on how society ought to be run, whether it's in terms of gender or other aspects of human rights. There's a really important question, which is how do you engage with that? Do you just dismiss it and say they're stupid, they're bad, they're primitive, or whatever? Or do you pretend that they're not part of civil society at all because they don't happen to agree with you? And I think in a way, the latter is what has been done. The people just said, well, we don't agree with these people and that's not important. And we just keep pressing governments to do what we want those governments to do. Well, of course you can do that, but then don't pretend that you're representing the whole of civil society. You're not. You're representing one set of perspectives. And if civil society really wants to be helpful in this broader, deeper, more potentially catastrophic conflict, then it needs to be engaging much more with the people who don't agree with them, might not even be prepared to engage with them. They disagree so deeply. So that's the first thing that I would say. The second thing about these different groups of people, the ones that sort of panic and then get used to it, and the ones that didn't take it seriously and now think, oh my goodness, what's going to go wrong here? I think that it's really important for us to try to address the world as it actually is, not the one that we wish it was, or indeed the one that we fear it is, but to try as much as possible to address things the way they are. I find this problem in politics, that an awful lot of my colleagues treat the voters as they wish the voters were, and then they get disappointed when they don't get voted for, because they find that's not actually what people think at all. And similarly, in terms of Putin, the intelligence for quite a long time was very clear. And I don't mean the kind of secret intelligence. Anybody watching the television could see how many tens of thousands of soldiers and vehicles and so on Putin was amassing on the border. And still people said, but he's not really going to do it, despite the fact that he had done it, in Chechnya, he had done it in Georgia, he had done it in Crimea. So why not believe? Oh, well, it would be completely crazy. Well, whatever you think about it, the truth was people were ignoring realities that were there. So what's important for us to do? And now, you may say that's very depressing. No, not necessarily, because not only are things often not as good as we wish they were, they are frequently not quite as bad as we think they are when we're thinking catastrophically. And for example, the idea that, well, goodness, then we go to the other extreme. Putin's not going to do anything. Oh, Putin's going to explode a nuclear bomb. So we go from one extreme of ignoring the possibility to another extreme that says it's going to be a nuclear winter and it's the end of the world. And actually, the probability is that if we were a little bit more in the center, well, he is going to invade, and there is a danger, but it should not determine everything that we do. And I think this is true generally, that things are not necessarily as unlikely to be as good as you wish, but they're also unlikely to be as bad as you fear. And so trying to be realistic about it. When it comes to business people, I think it's hard to not believe that the business environment is going to be very split and very tough for the foreseeable future. And the kind of globalization and just in time and all of this kind of thing is not going to be something that's going to be available for it. It's going to be, you're going to need to have reserves. It's going to be more just in case rather than just in time. And we're going to have to recognize it's going to be more difficult, and there's not going to be so much money around, at least in certain areas. And the kind of open markets that we'd welcomed and wanted to see as business people and as politicians indeed are likely to be much more challenging and difficult. But there are also new areas of business that have been opened up. I mean, COVID created all sorts of problems, but some people have done financially extremely well out of COVID and lockdowns, because they were nimble enough, or because they were in the right place at the right time, to orientate themselves to not just what the market would demand, but what the nation would need. And so I think business people are often much more able to be nimble. I mean, in the Northern Ireland situation, for example, we've got, the whole question of the Northern Ireland Protocol and the border and all of that kind of business. Business people have actually been able to negotiate that quite quickly and quite effectively, much more so than either politicians or pundits expected. So I think those are the ways in which I would respond, neither as optimistic as some people might wish to be, but nor as depressed and hopeless as some people may fear.
Thank you. Let me put some questions from the audience to you. First, how does post-colonial guilt feed into the decisions or worldview of certain European countries?
Well, I think to some extent it does, and not least that is because there are always people who are trying to increase the post-colonial guilt by saying, well, now we want a load of money because of slavery and so on. We want, you know, trillions of dollars or pounds or whatever it happens to be. So that does tend to exacerbate the whole thing a bit. There's no doubt about that, and that's often unhelpful because what it often means is even if those post-colonial powers are saying something helpful, it's not heard as helpful by the post-colonial countries. And in many cases, they simply don't engage because they say, oh, this is just, it's too much of a headache trying to work with these kind of people. I remember in a non-post-colonial period, but in a post-Second World War period, the situation of the relationship between Germany and Israel, for example. And when I used to do a lot of work and still do some work on the issue of Israel and the Palestinians and so on. And I was feeling that what was being done was going to make things worse in terms of Israel and Palestine. And I went to talk to a number of people in different parts of Europe, including very senior people in Germany. And they said to me, John, you're absolutely right. We completely agree. But there is no way that any of us are publicly going to come out critical of Israel, even when we believe that it is doing the wrong thing for themselves and for everybody else because of the Holocaust. And that simply just means we're not in a position, we feel, to say anything at all. So there's an example, not of post-colonial guilt, but of post-Holocaust guilt. And you know, there's every reason to feel guilty about what had been done. But if it gets you to the point where you're not able to make constructive judgments and engagements, that's not really in anybody's interest. So I think you have put your finger on something that's important. And again, something that needs thoughtful conversation and dialogue amongst those countries, rather than a position where the former colonial powers say, oh, it's all our fault and it's absolutely terrible and so on and so on. Or on the other hand, the post-colonial countries say, well, now, you know, we're going to hold you to ransom for that for the next 50 years and loads of money and so on. When, you know, there is a point at which you recognize what has happened in the past and do something about it. There's also a point in which you have to allow the past to be the past and get on with building a new future. And the question is, how do you get the balance between these two?
Thank you. What's the antidote to arrogance, and how do we strengthen different approaches when arrogance and exploitative behavior are still very much rewarded?
Well, you know, you might say that the best antidote to arrogance is defeat, because then you don't have anything to be arrogant about. But the truth of it is that doesn't even solve things. You know, President Trump was defeated in the election, and he simply refused to believe that he'd been defeated. Couldn't possibly be the case. Must have been, you know, an unfair election or bad counting or whatever it happens to be. So even that doesn't do it. And I think that engagement with the other is probably the best antidote. When you begin to discover that, yes, you bring something to the party, you have a lot in your history and your culture and your background, your perspective and your notions about life and so on. But actually the other guy and the other girl also has interesting things to bring to this, and I need to understand that more thoughtfully. One point at which that came to my attention was a number of years ago when I was president of Liberal International, and we ran into a problem with Beijing over Taiwan. I'll not go into the details of it, but we ran into a problem, and I had to have quite a number of meetings. And what became very clear to me was how powerfully they felt about what they called the century of humiliation, which was the whole period sort of from the Opium Wars onwards, in which Britain had, of course, played a central and extremely unhelpful role. And what I didn't understand until that engagement some years ago was quite how toxic the memory of that humiliating experience was. And it was still a key driver for people in positions of power in Beijing. Now, that was an important understanding, because it helped me to not be so content with how Britain had behaved, for example, over Hong Kong, which was a particular current political issue at that time, and be a little bit more cautious about it. Not necessarily to say these are right and these are wrong, but just pull back a little bit, draw one's horns in and say, I need to reflect on this, and I need to understand from the other person's perspective. Even if I don't end up agreeing with them, I need to understand it from their perspective. And for me, that engagement, that relationship is the best antidote to arrogance. When you have a real proper two-way relationship with somebody or between two countries, the arrogance tends to be mitigated, at least to some degree.
Thank you, very valuable. There is just a question about international law, which I will leave out, but I will ask this question. What would your advice be to Western politicians in how to approach Russia in the current crisis? Should they continue to open the communication lines, keep the communication lines open, but sanction Russia, sanction Russian oil and gas exports and others? What would your advice be to address the current situation?
We are in a war now. We are in a conflict. And the rules that apply, or how you have to behave once you actually get into a hot war, are different from those that pertain when you are in a situation of impending conflict or long-standing but not violent conflict. In that situation, the latter situation, you can engage much more easily in dialogue and in the kinds of things I've been talking about. Once you're into a war, you really do get pushed very much into supporting one side or the other. But I think you've got to be fairly clear about what you're doing and about your language. So for example, we talk about sanctions, and what we actually mean is economic warfare. Sanctions would be the case where the United Nations, as the legitimate global authority, set down certain rules, said, here's what's going to happen if you don't obey the rules. If somebody breaks the rules, you apply those sanctions. That's the proper use of the term sanctions, in my view. Where you have a situation where you start behaving in a punitive way, not having declared in advance that you're going to do it, not actually having the global authority to do that, then that's economic warfare, which is entirely justifiable. I'm not saying it's not justifiable, but that's what it is. And we're much better to use the words that give a proper description than pretend that it's something other than that, and that we have the right to do it and all these kinds of things. Second thing is, we've got to be careful who we sanction and about what. Where there are those who have quite clearly got ill-gotten gains from all sorts of things, well, that's one thing. I do become slightly uneasy when it emerges that every Russian involved in any cultural, sporting, or any other activity is to be banned for any foreseeable future, because we don't know how long this would last. To me, that's almost nationalism in reverse. It's pushing, these may be people who don't agree with what's going on, who protest against it, and so on. Are you going to put them in exactly the same box because they happen to come from the same country? I'm uncomfortable about that. Now, I don't say that there's an easy answer to it. I don't say that you should never do it. I don't say that, for example, whenever a national team is seen very much as a national team and representing the country, that perhaps should indeed fall foul of some kind of sanction. That I can absolutely understand that. But when there's an individual artist or musician or whatever, and you say, no, we're not going to listen to any of those, I think that's potentially dangerous, because you then start to not understand the cultural background that the country is coming from. And to me, for example, one of the unresolved disasters of the Second World War in Europe was that many German philosophers and thinkers and intellectuals from before the Second World War, even back to people like Goethe, really were not part of the education of many people in Western Europe after the Second World War, because, well, that was the Germans, and they all ended up as Nazis. And that's a very dangerous thing. And I think we need to be a bit more thoughtful and careful that we may not add to the very problems that we're trying to address. If we simply have a blanket ban on everything Russian. We could talk a lot about that, but I think one has to be careful, even though I understand the emotions that are driving people to make these decisions.
True, I can confirm both your statements. One, that the types of sanctions that have been introduced are actually economic warfare. From the case of Iran, as you know, Iran has been on the sanctions, Western sanctions, for a long time. And fact is that once you wage economic warfare, you actually compel the other side to become more confrontational, because they do feel that they're being attacked in a different form. And secondly, that those elements within the sanctioned country that are less desirable from the Western perspective are actually strengthened through Western sanctions. And that is basically policy backfiring again, I believe, in the absence of thoughtful, creative, and strategic thinking. So what could business organizations do to make the call for a peaceful settlement for the war louder? Obviously, as you said, businesses will suffer as well. And apart from the fact that they would like to see peace and a peaceful settlement, obviously they would also like to protect their interests. Is there something they can do to compel the politicians towards a peaceful settlement?
I don't think there's anything that one can do to compel, but I think one can open some doors. Now, as I said, what business people as individuals and groups will perfectly properly do is try to find ways in which within the law and within international law they can continue to do their business as best possible. But one of the things that I found was very helpful in the Northern Ireland context was to encourage business people to engage, for example, with those who had been doing terrorist warfare for a period of time, to engage with them, because it seemed to me that those people really didn't genuinely understand and appreciate the economic consequences for their own people of what was going on. And business people, rather than you're not bringing a political dimension to the thing, but as business people, to start to engage with all sides. I was going to say both sides, but actually with all sides, to say, look, you need to understand all the consequences of this. Now, I'll give you a completely different example. I was involved for many years with the World Federation of Scientists. And what happened, this really was emerged during the Cold War, where scientists, physicists mostly at the start, but later others, who understood the capacity and the danger of their science applied to the technology of war, began to work together and do some bits of research, Russians, Americans, French, British, and so on, to show what would happen if there was a nuclear war. And they took this to the generals on both sides. And the generals looked at it and they said, oh my goodness, we knew that would happen to the other side. We hadn't realized what would happen to our side. And they took it to the politicians, and the politicians said the same thing. And the result of that was the beginnings of the conversations internationally about how to reduce the level of nuclear warheads. Not because the scientists told politicians or military people what to do, but they helped explain the real consequences. And I think that's one of the things that business people can do, is to help politicians and others understand the consequences of their actions when they engage in all of these various sanctions. It's not just a question of you're going to punish the other guy. What are the consequences for your people of this? Do they understand that? What can be done to mitigate it? And I think that is an important thing that business people can do. There may be other things as well, but that's the one that comes most immediately to my mind.
Great. Here is a question that will connect us to our talk about 2 years ago. Does the Ukraine war mark the end of globalization? Those who didn't hear the last discussion we had, it was about deglobalization as a consequence of the pandemic. But what do you think about the impact of the Ukraine war on globalization?
I think it's colossal. And I think it has put the whole notion of globalization into reverse. I don't think it's just stalled it. I think it's put it into reverse. Because what it was based on really was the idea that that if you opened all of these things up, then not just economically, but politically and socially, and in terms of other issues like human rights and so on, we would move to a place where everybody was content to engage with each other on an equal basis. And it's clear that it's not as simple as that at all. And on the contrary, people have very different perspectives and very different aims. Again, this whole notion of globalization was to some extent predicated on the idea that the real driver for everybody was economic. And that was the drive. Well, there are some people, including in the West, for example, who say, well, actually, you know, I'm not sure that endless economic growth, whatever the cost in social terms, is what I want to see. I think there are other values that I have apart from just economic prosperity, whatever that might mean, and it's more complicated than it sounds. So I think people have come to recognize that there are different values and different ways of judging these things, and we need to maybe both respect that and allow it to inform our critical faculties and our thinking more than has been the case before. But for the present, the understanding of globalization, I mean, we are a global village, we are one world, and to that extent, you know, there's no alternative to globalization. But in terms of what globalization came to mean economically, politically, technologically, and so on, yes, I think that has stalled and gone into reverse. And we shall just have to see what the outcome of this war and other related conflicts that emerge from it, what that is, before we have much of an idea about what is in front of us all.
Thank you. As a last question, John, I know you work a lot with complexity theory. You also mentioned it here. What can we all do to familiarize people around us, colleagues, maybe politicians, with the complexity theory? Any advice on how to sort of deepen our understanding of the complexities of the world?
Well, there are quite a lot of books around, longer and shorter, both about the ideas of complexity theories, because there's more than one, and complexity science, both as a kind of model or way of understanding things, and as applied to various specific things, complexity theory in economics, in military approaches, in society in general. Some very specific things. How does complexity science help us to deal with traffic flows in a big city? You know, so there's lots and an increasing amount being written about this. Some areas get more attention than others. The world center for complexity science is the Santa Fe Institute in the United States. And they have a website. If you just Google Santa Fe Institute, SFI, it will come up and you will see some of the things there. But if you even just Google or go onto Amazon to look at Introduction to Complexity and so on, you'll find lots of material there. And I think the thing is to just start understanding that this is a different way of approaching and understanding things, and maybe, you know, maybe we'll have a conversation in a year or two's time on this excellent platform that you have about complexity and how it helps us to understand a world which is not just complicated but complex.
Thank you so much. I look forward to that discussion, hopefully in the future. In any case, you helped us all understand the current crisis and the complexity. I really am grateful for your time, for your insight. Thank you everyone for participating. Thank you, Megla and Khadija, for organizing this. And I look forward to future opportunities to engage with all of you. Thank you
very much.
Take care.
Thank you very much, Bijan. Great to see you again. All the best. Thank you, Magla.
Thank you, everyone. We hope that you will join us at our next VGL. And if we have your emails, we'll be sending you information about our next VGL forums and future ones. So please make sure that you subscribe to us for our newsletter. And we're very much looking forward to seeing you soon. We hope that we answered most of the questions. Thank you, Bijan, for picking up those questions. You know, please contact us if you have suggestions for future VGLs, any other topics that you think would be relevant. We'd be very happy to look into those and explore those for you. Thank you again for your participation. It meant a lot to us, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.